Well, I'd like to welcome you all to Collaboration Conversations. As you know, I am Judy Carabo. I am the Chief Collaborations Officer for Mission+Strategy and the facilitator for Collaboration Conversation. I was also the Executive Director for Family Shelter Service, a domestic violence agency serving the western suburbs of the Chicago metropolitan area. And actually, Family Shelter Service led a strategic merger with our number one referral source, Metropolitan Family Services. We actually closed on that merger April of 2019. In some respects, it seems like it was yesterday, and sometimes it seems like it was a lot longer ago than that. But really, the point of that merger, that strategic merger, that strategic partnership, was to be able to provide this um, increased continuum of services for victims of domestic violence, making it easier for them to be able to leave an abusive relationship. And so, really, today's conversation is somewhat near and dear to my heart. And I have two very, very special guests. And we're going to really talk about mergers and strategic partnerships from the board's perspective, which there's not a lot of information about. So, it'll be really interesting to get the perspective of two board members. So, I'd like to first introduce Christy Harris. She was the chair of the board of directors for Family Shelter Service at the time of our merger. Christy also has this really rich background in HR and talent management and inclusive diversity. She's worked for Allstate and is currently the Chief Human Resource Officer for CCC Intelligent Solutions. I'd also like to introduce Toyin Ogun. He served on the board of directors again at Family Shelter Service and was the chair of our joint negotiating or joint planning committee. Toyin has also extensive experience in HR and mergers and acquisitions. He recently retired from his role as Chief Human Resource Officer for Hobby. Congratulations, Toyin. And is currently an adjunct professor for Southern New Hampshire University. So welcome and thank you both so much for taking time to share your experience and wisdom. I'm going to just jump right in if that's okay with both of you and just start off by asking you from your perspective, what were the main reasons for pursuing a merger strategy and how aligned were board members on this decision?
Judy, I think you actually alluded to it in your opening, and the primary thing we thought about was our clients or the domestic, violence survivors or victims, and making sure that we could provide continuous care. And what we realized is like it required multiple agencies to be able to provide that coordination of care. And so we thought about who do we partner with primarily and who could support the victims most holistically and coordinate those services in a way that helped create sustainability and not to return to the abusive relationship but able to thrive post being exposed to a relationship like that. I think the second reason was really around funding. Like at the time, we were starting to see some nonprofits shut down. We started to see funding becoming more scarce or reduced. And we were really intentional about trying to partner with organizations that we thought were financially strong, but also had more resources available to our victims and our survivors so that they had the best opportunity for living their best life post being impacted by this type of abusive relationship. I'll ask Toyin what he thought about the board. I have some thoughts, but I thought maybe Toyin, you might want to start, and then I'm happy to add color, to whatever you say.
No problem. We had a different, in terms of our board, the demographics in terms of chronology of time on the board were diverse. So we had board members who had been part of the journey and the discussion about a merger and/or an acquisition over time. So it was rather relatively easy to get those board members on board. Then we had newer board members who were just getting to be part of the dialogue and the understanding of our mission, our focus around client services. And it took a little bit more work. But ultimately, there was very good alignment that we needed to move forward with the merger with Metropolitan Family Services.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is it required several conversations. And sometimes, as you might imagine, when you think about change management or when you're embarking on such an initiative like this, you take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back to get everyone grounded, and then you might have to have another conversation to get aligned. I think it was also along our journey, Toyin, we probably revisited certain things to make sure that everyone was operating from the same place and information, and particularly those people that were part of your team in the planning or merger had more information than sometimes the rest of the board, and we forgot that at times, and we had to bring and catch people up along the way so that when we were thinking about what the decisions we were making at any point to make sure that this was passing the gates, to continue the process, that everybody had full information. So I don't think you can underestimate how much communication you need to keep people informed.
Just as like a little bit of a background information, so the Joint Planning Committee is, and I think we had 4 representatives from our board and 4 representatives from Metropolitan's board.
Right.
And then those board members, like you guys were saying, would go back to their respective boards and bring board members, the full boards, up to date as to what was going on insofar as the conversations collectively between the 2 organizations. And I think it sounds to me like what you both are saying is that having really clear goals, right, around the services to the clients and the better or potentially increased funding or more stable funding. So having really clear goals and then just the patience with the communication were really important to bringing board members along.
That is absolutely correct, Judy. For one of a better word, communication is the currency of the realm. A miss there makes it incredibly difficult to actually move on or move off a particular point.
Mhm.
To Christy's point, we had to have several conversations. We had to keep on going back because there was sometimes a divergence in what they believe they've heard and what
Mhm.
they think they've heard.
Mhm.
And this notion of going back, even though we had 8 members, go back to Metropolitan, go back to DuPage Family Services, and communicate the same things and re-communicate those things
Yeah.
became really important.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really, really good point about just that patience and that communication, and it's not necessarily, while it is repetition, it's important to be able to bring people along. That repetition is important, and I love the communication is the currency. That's a great phrase. That's a great phrase. So how did you approach the planning and negotiation phase? Like, what were some key considerations or factors that influenced the decision-making process, at least from your perspective
Yeah.
or from Family
So
Shelter's perspective?
there were, to build on the earlier question, there were a lot of pre-conversations and a lot of conversations on the why. And we were all aligned on the why, this notion of client services and infrastructure. But there were a couple of other things that became really important as we went through, and I've seen this in other mergers and acquisitions as well, which is this notion of cultural alignment and making sure that the cultures, while they may not mesh, we fully understand what some of the pluses and the deltas are. So that was one piece around cultural alignment. And the second piece is also around client alignment. If we say this is about our mission and enhanced services, as we look at both organizations together, are we actually going to be able to do that? So having those conversations up front became critical and important. And lastly, from an employee standpoint, it became important to us as we were talking about this merger that there couldn't be any victors and there couldn't be any vanquished. We had to make sure that people essentially had to be at best whole and making sure that we had this from especially from a total reward standpoint, that nobody was going to be losing anything. If anything else, there will be an upgrade or a leveling of our compensation rewards packages, and that became really important. And I think it keeps on going back to the fundamental question of whatever we do, will it be accretive to our client base, and will our employees benefit from it? And those are the sort of the probing questions we always started with anytime we had our meetings.
Yeah, I think Toyin did a good job of explaining that, particularly because he led, that committee. I think the only thing that I would add is you always have to keep going back to like why are you doing this? Like, what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? And then you should establish some guiding principles, early, and keep going back to, are you living into those guiding principles, and are you working towards achieving the outcomes for what you set out to do in the first place?
Yeah, it sounds like from your perspectives, the being very clear about the values for making decisions was really important.
Yes.
And that there were some issues to make sure were addressed in the negotiating process or the planning process, such as culture and that staff were taken care of, and that those were important things. Um, Even though at the center it was around clients, those were important things to support the services to clients, culture and staff.
Yeah, and I think you can make decisions, right, like in isolation, but if you start making several decisions in isolation versus thinking about it from a systems, perspective, or the aggregate of all your decisions, you may actually end up someplace that you didn't think you were going to end up, because they have accumulating effect. And that is, one of the things that why I said, like, remember why you are doing this, like what is your effort, and then what are the guiding principles, because that will ensure that you're keeping focused on the bigger picture versus getting lost in the detail of that moment of time that you are approaching a decision point or a problem that you uncovered that you hadn't planned for.
Yeah. So the why ends up being the North Star.
Correct.
Yeah.
And a framework, to Chris's point, around decision making, around the North Star. Independent decisions have, to Chris's point, have sometimes a cumulative negative effect without thinking about the larger picture or the North Star. And having a framework around decision making, which is what we had, was powerful and important.
You both have deep for-profit experience. You both have deep prior board experience as well, but you have deep for-profit experience and mergers and acquisition experience in the for-profit world. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the similarities and differences in for-profit mergers and nonprofit mergers, and particularly where you might have seen board members get hung up with a for-profit framework versus a nonprofit kind of framework.
Y- Uh, I think ultimately, at least in the ones I've been involved in, it really comes down to three things: why you're doing this. One is enhanced capabilities. I want to buy this organization because they have a set of capabilities that I really badly need, and that gives me more access to market, et cetera, et cetera. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is around customer products and services. I'll be able to, you know, get more products, I'll be able to get more services, and that enables my organization to grow. And thing number three is, obviously the financials, and which in a for-profit organization, we usually start with the financials because we have stakeholder and stakeholder and shareholder accountability. So I see those as similar things, other than the laser focus on financials in a for-profit situation. It's not, I didn't, in all the not-for-profit M&As I've been involved in, that is usually secondary or tertiary, which I believe is a good thing, because it's a non-profit for a reason. And in fact, I'm in a non-profit now that's going through an M&A, and it's actually going to cost us money to do that. But what it means is there will be expensive services. There will be a better infrastructure for this youth that don't have a place to go, and it gives us better cachet when we ask for funding at the state board level. So there's similarities, but there are also differences depending on what the mission of the organization is.
Yeah, I agree with that, Twain. I think there's more similarities than there's differences. I think maybe the major difference is the stakeholders and how much they actually weigh in or control your decision rights, or how quick they allow you to get to the value that you set out to when you uh, approach the merger or acquisition. So, you certainly have customers or clients in some way or fashion most of the time, and you certainly have employees that you have to think about. And then there's leadership, and you have a board. But in profit, you also have shareholders who expect a routine production, let's just say, of your results, and they can giveth or taketh away as they think about investing in your organization, and those things can hurt
Yeah.
pretty they can hit you hard if you're not prepared for delivering the results that you want, particularly when you think about executives and shareholders and the influence they have around, say, on pay, and or they can vote board directors off the board if they don't feel like they're holding the leadership accountable.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk and ask you about obstacles. So every merger, every strategic partnership has its obstacles. And what do you recall from the Family Shelter Service, Metropolitan Family Service process? What obstacles do you recall encountering at a board level? And how did the board work through them?
Uh, I would say the obstacles we encountered weren't unexpected. And I'll go back to communication and
Mhm,
a change management plan. We had board members who had, rightfully so, a lot of questions, and that could go back to chronology of time on the board, or with on understanding a mission focus of the Page Family Services. So I think where we spent most of our time was really around understanding, getting the board to understand why,
mhm,
and going back time and time again. And I wouldn't actually call that an obstacle. It became a labor intensive challenge. And essentially for us, it means uh, having a stakeholder map, which we did, one-to-one constructive engagement opportunities, and going back and repeating and repeating and repeating. So when we started, I don't think we figured we spend that
yeah.
much time on communication. So it became, okay, now it's not part of the work, and we have to do it and do it in a way that's engaging and gets questions answered.
Mhm, mhm,
The second opportunity slash obstacle was when we got information on the benefits plans and the total reward structure of Metropolitan. We had to do some work around understanding the differences,
mhm,
because in some cases there were very stark differences. But we started with a guiding principle of, we didn't want to injure our employees financially when we
mhm,
go through this process. So getting through that and understanding it in a rapid way, in a quick way, was important. And
mhm.
the last thing is, we did go through a culture survey. So we had a culture survey, and we got the results back. And as can be expected, there were differences. There were things we needed to make sure pre and post integration we were focused on, and that became a part of the overall project plan.
Yeah, and more specifically, I think there were a couple things that I remember, and Judy, maybe this will ring a bell for you, but I remember us thinking about, well, the long-term sustainability of the shelter. Like,
Mhm,
if we merge with an organization, are they going to promise for infinity that this shelter will stay in the place that it is today? Or are we going to lose the name, like the branding aspect of Family Shelter Services? And, what if they want to rebrand it? And we've worked so hard for that brand, and we don't, that's how people know to reference or refer people to this organization. And so I remember some of those specific things that we got, and in some cases dug really our heels in on, and was hard to move the board, forward without some sort of commitments made on behalf of, Metropolitan to be able to guarantee. And I was like, Toyin will say this, but like there's a lot of promises made in mergers and acquisitions, and you might have the best intention, but 5 years, 10 years down the line, it's hard to say you can keep those commitments, for forever. But that was part of a lot of ongoing dialogue that I think some of our board members had a really hard time of wrapping their minds around to be able to move forward. And then, just like Toyin said around the culture survey, like there's things you find in due diligence. And the question is like the magnitude of the impact it's going to have. And sometimes you overestimate the magnitude, and sometimes you underestimate the magnitude. And I think we knew that there were some cultural differences. I don't think we knew to the extent that some of those things, like some of the finer things that would come up, post merger integration, that, like how freely can you speak, truth, and things like that, that came up that were more operational, but, were part of change management that's required. And and I'm not talking about oftentimes, and Toyin will appreciate this coming from an HR background. People always say communicate, communicate, communicate. And that's true. But communication is not change management, and you need both.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a really good point. That communication is not change management. You use communication to help manage change, but it's not the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and people always talk about how people hate change, but what they hate more is poorly managed change.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And the thing that I just keep the thing that strikes me about what both of you are saying is the care to leave no one behind in this process. And I think both from from a staff perspective, right? But also from a board perspective, right? Not leaving anyone behind and not going, oh, we don't need to have that person's vote, right? And so we don't need to worry about communicating with that person. It's this focus of and respect for the relationships on the board that I keep hearing, that even though you might have the majority of people voting yes for the merger, there was still this commitment to make sure that people were heard, their questions were heard, their doubts were heard, they were addressed, and they were brought along in the process.
Yep.
Yeah, engaging your resistors early actually helps you on the back end of your sustainability and the implementation of change.
I do remember strategically putting, I think, one of those original naysayers on the joint planning committee to help with their own understanding, right, and their own comfort level, but also being able to, if that person was able to come along in the process, then help other potential naysayers come along in the process. And I think that speaks to what you're saying, Christy.
Yeah.
And that was brilliant, by the way. That person became an advocate.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to what Christy alluded to earlier, which is this notion of great communication, early engagement with the chain resistors to bring them along.
I
The
was
one,
just I was
sorry.
I just was going to say really quickly, I was just smart enough to know that I needed really smart people on the board. So that idea came from you all.
You're too kind, Judy. And the one thing I will add is language matters. And I remember we got bogged down in one of our meetings around somebody asked out of the blue, are we being acquired or is this a merger? And there's a difference. And there's a very clear difference. So using words, and if it is an acquisition, let's say that way up front. So everyone is clear that that's going to happen. And by the way, it's hardly ever a merger of equals, and letting people know that is okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it just takes one more thing off of the list when it comes to the stakeholder engagement and the change management work.
So
Yeah.
true.
Well, and it's truthful and it's honest, right? And
Right.
that helps
Correct.
with the like, if you're feeling betrayed because somebody didn't tell you the truth, that's going to make it more difficult to move through change.
Correct.
So,
Yeah, and the last thing that I would add that Toyin just sparked for me is it's really good to plan in advance of how you're going to think about the post-merger integration. I
mhm.
have a past experience where my previous company, we acquired another company and we sort of committed to them being standalone. And 8 years later, then we integrated and they felt like they were getting acquired all over again. And it was pretty hard on those employees, and I just say, like, be clear on what you're trying to do
Yeah.
and then move towards that.
Now I want to ask you about any unexpected benefits or positive outcomes that occurred because of the merger.
I'm gonna I'll start, and I'm gonna take it from the board perspective.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because even as board members, sometimes you have to make a decision behalf on what you think is best for the organization and not what's best on, for you personally. And we had addressed the fact that as we were merging, that may mean that board members are no longer board members, part of this, organization, because the organization doesn't necessarily need a board when it's part of a larger board. And so we were really intentional as we were thinking about this transition and how to still ensure that the benefits of our clients and, the purpose, it was still sort of being lived into that. And as a result of that, we were able to negotiate board seats on the larger board of Metropolitan Family Shelter, on the local board for DuPage, County, and for the Legal Aid Society, because we had an attorney part of our board who was, active in this. And so our reach actually became widespread, and still we're able to be strong advocates for domestic violence prevention and, those services for those, survivors. And I think that was maybe not something we originally set out to do, but pretty clear pretty early in that process was able to figure out that there was a path that would work for our board members. And then we just asked, where people's preferences are. And then we looked for fit and then tried to make the best decisions based on all the criteria that was available.
Mhm. Nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
I don't have much more to add because Chrissy really hit it on the head. I think it wasn't part of the original discussions, but it became clear there will be some benefit
Mhm.
to having our board members continue to serve in their community. From a personal standpoint, I got to be part of the Metropolitan Board. I got to be part of the Human Resources Committee, and I got to be part of delivering some work around the employee culture survey, for
Mhm.
instance, and gave me an enhanced view of how big not-for-profit organizations work. So there was a personal benefit for me, but there was also a community benefit from our board members going back out into the community. I think one of the things that was recognized early on that we did have a good, strong board.
Mhm.
And these are folks that are in a resource-starved community. There are not a lot of
Yeah.
good board members who are able to go into the community and do good work. So our board was, I think 100% of us got placed in other
Mhm.
boards around the community.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I think that. Oh, go
oh,
ahead,
I'm
Christy.
sorry. I was just going to say, I'm not sure Toyin would agree with this, but I actually got to follow and go along with him to the Metropolitan, Family Board and the HR. So he couldn't like shake me, and we got to still like be a dynamic duo, but like in another part of the organization.
Yeah.
Well, but I think you raise actually a really good point because part of the impact to the board is the loss of relationships that were formed over years. And so in this case, it sounds like some of them were able to continue on, but that's a real loss for a board as they do this kind of work.
Well, and if you think about, and I know this was quite a bit of a culture shock for me that I was not prepared for. And Toyin, I'm not sure how you felt about this, but we were 18 people or so and
Hmm.
part of our
Yeah.
board, and Metropolitan's like 80 people
Hmm.
part of the board. And to know Toyin, like especially when I went into the first meeting, and I saw all these people, and there were several on the phone. I felt lost because I was used to being such a tight knit board, that having Toy in there, and actually Emily too, who was
Mhm.
part of our board, be part of it. It was nice just to have a smiling face or a connection, because otherwise it was too overwhelming for me.
Mhm. Mhm. Would you say that the merger accomplished the goals that you wanted to have accomplished? Like from even from like a longer term perspective, because we're now what, 4 years, if I do my math right, 4 years since the actual closing. Do you both think that the merger did what it was supposed to do?
From my perspective, I think about what's happened in the time frame since 2019, and of course, at that time, we didn't know what COVID was going to bring. And we also know that when you were in isolation or had to stay at home, and you no longer had a workplace to escape to, or other places to be outside the home, that actually became more dangerous for domestic violence victims, or people part of an abusive relationship. And I trust that, like, with the coordination of care and these extended services, that we're able to help provide a better outcome for those people who were living or are still living in that situation today.
I would say initially, and I agree to Chris's points around post-COVID and the implications that's had for gender-based violence, especially. But initially, what we set out to do, we did, and I think we did well. From a best practice standpoint, I do think in other mergers I've been involved in, there have been ongoing post-integration meetings that have actually spanned a year.
Mhm.
So there's a dashboard that measures, we set out to do A, B, C, all the way to Z, and where are we? It seems like overkill, but candidly, it gives a sense of closure to how we're doing, and it gives the acquiring board or the merge organization sort of an opportunity to have a dialogue with maybe a board that's no longer functioning,
Mhm.
but you can use that opportunity to get information and get feedback.
Mhm.
So, did we set out to do what we said against our mission and our values? Yes. To Chris's point, where are we today, especially in a post-COVID world? And what
Mhm.
impact did that merger and acquisition have on the current state of the organization?
Mhm. And you may have already addressed this question. So I'm going to ask this a couple of ways. One is, as we wrap up this conversation, is there any words of wisdom or advice you would like to give other board members or other senior leadership of nonprofit agencies? Or maybe it is what's the thing that I didn't ask that you wish you had a chance to talk about? What's not been said yet?
Um, to start with, what the literature says about mergers and acquisitions, about 70 to 90% of them fail. And they fail for one or two primary or secondary reasons. One is poor integration, the second is culture. So, having an integration, Christy earlier called it a change management plan, is really, really important. And secondly, the people issues, especially around communication and having a very structured communication process, one-to-one alignment, one-to-one engagement, one-to-one discussions. When you think you've communicated, communicate again till someone says stop, then you know you're doing your job. But those, I think, are critical and important because, you know, it, the work of mergers and the work of acquisitions is actually not that terribly difficult. It's the human element that becomes really important, and getting it right is a non-negotiable.
I think Toyin said it really well. Stakeholdering, communication, change management, staying grounded on why you're doing this and your guiding principles, and continue to really challenging yourself. Like, are you making the right decision? Because you can make a decision to walk away, and that may be the best decision, but sometimes people feel like there's too much sunk cost in that and that you have to push forward, but the reality is you don't.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for sharing your reflections about the process, the merger process from the board's perspective. And I also want to thank you both for your service to the community through the Family Shelter Service Board. And years ago, I said this then, and I'll say it again. It was truly, truly an honor to work with you on this process, but also to work with you and work helping victims of domestic violence. So thank you so much for your time then, and thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Judy.
Hey, Toyin, wouldn't you agree that you got to have a good executive director to be able to execute against this too?
I will say, not only do I agree, that is a critical success factor.
Yeah, Judy, I think Toyin and I would agree. You played a critical role in this, and I think it's all parties need to be engaged and working together, and sometimes that requires having difficult conversations, but they are intended for the best outcomes.
Yep.
And thank you for inviting Toyin and I to speak, and it was really great to reconnect with both of you.
Yeah,
Same here.
Thank you.
Thank you.